Tonight's topic is approaching Gnostic Scripture. It's a pretty interesting topic. It came up across from one of our viewers.
Absolutely. And it was interesting. We had done a show on the Gnostic Scriptures earlier, and one of our very loyal viewers asked the question, pointing out that religion scholar Philip Jenkins has addressed the issue of so-called theological revisionists who seem to place a greater priority on the so-called lost scriptures than they do on the canonical scriptures. So, we could canonical Old and New Testaments.
Right.
And he, talked about the fact that there could be an inverted fundamentalism where we are inclined to, say, well, the Gospel of Judas is the real story, was one of the examples that he used. And there's a real problem there, of course, because, in some cases we are switching one myth for another.
Absolutely.
And there's that tendency there. So, what do we make? What do we make of all this? Is there a place for traditional scriptures? Are we going to become wedded to the so-called Gnostic scriptures and just, base all of our practices and beliefs on them? Or is there a different approach that we need to be taking as Gnostics? What do you think, Bishop Ken?
Wow. Well, I think, first off, I think we need to kind of address kind of the idea of inverted fundamentalism. And I see it all the time. We can go all over Facebook and find a variety of Gnostic groups out there. And kind of rehashing what you just said. I mean, people will say that this is, wow, look at this, look at the Gospel of Judas, look at the Gospel of Thomas, look at this. And kind of want to make that as like the end-all, say-all of anything that's Gnostic. I think that both you and I probably take a little bit different approach, is that we kind of look at the whole body of Scripture. I know we've discussed it in previous shows. I think there's always a exoteric and an esoteric way of looking at Scripture.
Sure.
Unlike maybe many of our mainstream Christian brethren, we can look at the canonical Gospels and see the deep meaning and symbolism, and even look at things in the Old Testament and the beauty of the Psalms and see those deep meanings that are behind there without taking kind of a literalist fundamentalist approach to them. So I really think that if we kind of throw out, the Bible as our scriptures, we're literally throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
I think you and I both have fundamentalist backgrounds, and so this is something that I'm constantly checking. I'm constantly checking, and I remember when I was a young teenager, before I had converted to evangelical Christianity, hearing about the lost books of the Bible. And having a look at them, and they were just kind of a mishmash to me, and I didn't see that there was anything particularly significant in them at all. But it's something that I now as a Gnostic struggle with, that I don't want to fall into the literalism or the dependency on written scripture, whether it is, looking at Thunder Perfect Mind or the Gospel of Thomas, or, what I'm finding in the canonical scriptures as well. So I'm constantly at war with this fundamentalist tendency inside me when I'm dealing with the scriptures. And sometimes I have to really work very hard at stepping back, as you note, looking at the esoteric possibilities, the esoteric interpretations of these scriptures. What's really being said here? Is this simply a story, or are there other levels? And how would the members of these communities understood these scriptures? And the one thing that I've read some scholars point out is that the canonical scriptures, the Gospels, the epistles from the apostles, in many cases, certainly did have their own communities, and probably we are lacking in understanding. But there's also kind of there's some universal aspects to them as well. They're fairly easy to understand, which is not always true about the so-called Gnostic Scriptures.
Right.
Some of these are some very odd stories, and were probably made a lot more sense to initiated members of closed communities. That's my suspicion. So when we're working with them now, we're lacking even. We have even a greater lack of context than we do with the canonical scriptures.
And I would agree. I mean, you know, the modern Gnostic Church, unlike what some may want people to believe, there is not a continuation from the quote-unquote Gnostics of the past to the present. Right. So we don't know firsthand of how these particular communities dealt with particular Gnostic texts, what their particular meanings and interpretations were. If they were strictly left up for interpretation up to the individual, if there were certain members of their congregation or perfectae who may have had deeper insight that they shared this particular gnosis with. But again, kind of going back here, I think that we can really get ourselves in a bunch of hurt when we start becoming fundamentalists in either direction. Right. Whether we're fundamentalists with only the Gnostic Scripture or whether we're fundamentalist with just the canon Scripture. A big fault I see, especially for those who kind of get into kind of Gnosticism and things esoteric from kind of other backgrounds, whether it's from pagan backgrounds or even some of my, like the Lemic brethren. They tend to want to throw anything with quote-unquote Christian overtones to it. Okay, yeah. It's like, okay, we are in the New Age now. We are in the age, Aquarian age. We are in the Eon of Horus or whatever it is. And they tend to want to, again, throughout the scriptures, get rid of this. We're going to replace it with this. And I think, again, we can get in a kind of a load of hurt because we're not really giving any credence to the deep mystical meanings that these scriptures can give, and I would argue gave to the early Gnostic communities that were out there. I think that many of them may have been exposed to a variety of different texts, not just one or two. Some maybe just had the Gospel of Thomas. Some may have just had the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Some may have had thrown into that the Gospel of Philip. Some may have also had, the Gospel of John. Some may have had, fragments of Matthew or other texts which we would recognize today. But to think that they were probably limited to just one or two Gospels or texts and that they kind of threw that out, I think we're kind of doing the whole entire movement a huge disservice.
Yeah, and I think that an attempt to, say, for example, reconstruct Gnosticism, certainly I am not denying the importance of many of these texts. Some of these texts just blow my mind and offer me a very different understanding of the Jewish Christian myth, and that's wonderful. But I think that it's important to develop a notion, in my view, of continuous revelation for those of us who are Gnostics. My suspicion is that the early Gnostics, like the early Christians, probably also received a lot of spoken prophetic utterings from teachers and members of the community. And my question is today, okay, is it possible for us to continue to develop our own body of mystical teaching? Not saying that it's necessarily channeled through us, but as communities looking at and reworking myths such that we do not become utterly dependent on written texts that served other communities probably very well in the past.
And I think you've got a really good, valid point there. One of the things that we've discussed on the show many times, and sometimes we're even criticized for it when we're asked, like, how do you define Gnosticism? And I might throw up my hands. Oh boy, that's a tough one. And because for us, and I can't speak for our producer, I can't speak for you, so I'm going to speak for me. for me, when I try to just define this, I always say it is sometimes much easier to say what it is not than what it is. To use an analogy, it's like trying to describe chocolate to someone who's never had chocolate. I can tell you that it's sweet and it's creamy and the way that it melts on my tongue and all of its delicious goodness. But till you've experienced chocolate, you will never know what chocolate is. You never will. And Gnostic Scripture, they may touch my soul. It may help to enlighten my mind. It may help bring me onto that path of Gnosis, but it is not Gnosis. Gnostic Scripture alone, I can pick up any of my Gnostic books back here, the Gnostic Bible. I can read them until I'm blue in the face. It's not going to bring me to Gnosis.
Yeah.
It's not.
No.
And, so as far as, newer writings and newer teachings, of course, I believe so. I think that in the early Gnostic communities and I think probably throughout history that there have always been people with the gift of things like prophecy, the gift of kind of very much intuition and really tuned into Gnosis. I mean, for myself, as we used to work together in the past, I mean, one of the things that I was criticized and my church was criticized for is that we just didn't limit ourselves to the Bible and Gnostic Scripture. We were very much open to other things. We were open to the writings of the Sufis, to the texts of the Muslims, to the Quran. We were open to Thelemic writings. We would have been open to Taoist writings. I mean, anything that speaks of those fundamental kind of universal truths that makes any of us go, that's a glimmer. Yeah. Wow.
A glimmer. Yep.
A glimmer where that kind of gives us an epiphany for one moment. We think beyond of that box that we are taught of what God is or what religion is. And we start thinking of outside of that box. That for us, was always how we looked at what should be part of that canon of Gnostic Scripture. It shouldn't really be limited just because of a church's history or because we came out of a Christian tradition or because most of our members came out of a particular tradition or not. So I think that, in my opinion, the canon, if you will, can be grown. And I think there's no reason for that it cannot continue to grow from new members.
Yeah. The other thing that I would point out is that the reading a text with no preparation. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations in which a person might not be hit by a pink beam of light right between the eyes because that's what's supposed to happen. But I've often found that some preparation before reading sacred writings makes a huge difference in my apprehension of them. For example, I'm involved with the Gurdjieff work, also known as the Fourth Way, and it was my work in the Gurdjieff Fourth Way that assisted me in, or it actually changed the way I read the book of James in the canonical New Testament. And when you see talking about faith without works is dead, and how the fact that we don't have control over what we say manages to drag us into all kinds of trouble. This is stuff that unless you've done a certain amount of work on yourself may not make so much sense. After a while, going back to that book of the Bible, after having been trained in a tradition that doesn't really make a whole lot of use of scriptures, other than Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, and even that's treated a bit differently, it made an enormous difference in my reading of the scriptures, which is why I think many Christians who do practice their faith understand this and go back regularly to reading the scriptures, because the more work you do, the more meaning the scriptures will have. And I think that that's probably going to be true of other types of sacred writings, although some of them have not stood the test of time the way that the canonical scriptures have. So we'll have to see, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, as we've had this modern Gnostic movement, which has had access to these scriptures, it'll be interesting to see what kind of use is made of them, and whether something else is produced over time.
And what's interesting, especially from like our particular approach, coming from kind of the approach of the apostolic Gnostic churches, is that, again, even if we look within our history, well, those churches came into being before those Gnostic scriptures were found, before the Nag Hammadi was found.
Yeah.
For the most part, the Gospel of John was considered the most sacred of all the Gospels. We had limited, some of the Pistis Sophia. There were fragments of things like the Gospel of Thomas and several other early Gnostic texts, but definitely not the body of work which we now know is Gnostic text.
Yeah.
So we've already seen a progression within modern Gnostic movements of them incorporating Gnostic scripture. So what's the next 100 years going to be? Are there going to be other texts that those who feel drawn to this particular current go, wow, this has given me epiphanies. And sometimes I think others get criticized. I try not to criticize some of my brethren in other movements whose things are different than we may approach it, simply because it's not something I work every day. It's not something I may meditate upon every day. If I did, I may find lots of particular enlightenment around that. Even now, I find myself drawn to a variety of different things. And I can find Gnosis, whether I'm looking at Hindu text or Buddhist text. I'm not limiting myself to purely Christian gospels or Gnostic gospels, to where I'm looking for that source, because the source is one source. It may have many different names, but it's one source.
Yes. That's I don't know that I agree that it's all one source, but that may be an area in which you and I disagree, Bishop Ken.
It may be something to continue in discussion.
I think absolutely. Absolutely. Bishop Ken, my friend. I do believe we have some news.
Fantastic. Let's hear about this news.
Well, actually, it's kind of old news. We are still looking for people who are willing to volunteer to help produce and do some technical work on Gnostic NYC projects, including these videos and some possible podcasts and other things coming up. Do contact Father Tony at info@gnosticnyc.com if you think that you might be able to help.
And I wanted to stress everybody, Father Tony does a great job for us.
Yeah, he does.
But, all those of us who know Father Tony knows that he stretches himself pretty thin. I mean, between his work with the AJC, his work with the Boy Scouts of America, his work with this, and so many other projects that he's on, we really appreciate that he gives us the time that he does. But as we would like to see things grow, we really need the help. So any of you out there, please contact us at info@gnosticnyc.com.
All right.
Well, as usual, we appreciate everyone's comments and feedback. We try to be active on both YouTube and on Facebook. Make sure you leave comments for us on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook. We are on Facebook at Facebook/TalkGnosis. You can always email us at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. We do appreciate it. Again, even this topic tonight came through from one of our loyal and regular viewers.
Yes, and we really appreciate it.
And it's one of those topics that when I seen in the show notes, it was like, you see my comment, wow, this is something that I think needs to be discussed.
Yeah, as soon as we saw it, we said, okay, we got to do a show on it. So I'm glad we were able to get it done.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, as always, this has been a production of the Gnostic NYC Network. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends, click the like button, and subscribe to our channel. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the views of Gnostic NYC or any other organization. No animals were harmed during the production of this show. And for more Talk Gnosis, tune in every Wednesday for new episodes. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.